The world outside is growing quiet, and a story is waiting for you in the stillness. Welcome to Midnight Murmurs Studio, your safe harbor from the noise of the day. Find a comfortable place, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Before our story begins, a gentle reminder for your peaceful rest. For the deepest sleep, it's best to keep your phone at a safe distance from your head. So please take a moment to place your phone on a nearby table or chair. And while it's in your hand for this last moment, a quick tap on like and subscribe becomes a quiet signal to us, a soft murmur in the dark that lets us know these stories are a comfort to you. It's what keeps our studio going. Thank you for that. Now, settle in the heart of the whispering mountains, hidden from the rush of the modern highways and the noise of the great cities, lay the village of Stillwater. It was a place where the winter snow piled high on the rooftops like thick blankets of white wool, and the chimneys puffed gentle gray smoke into the crisp, cold air. In Stillwater, nobody ran. Nobody checked their phones every 5 minutes. It was said that even the wind slowed down when it entered the valley, out of respect for the silence. At the end of the cobblestone main street, nestled between an old bakery and a quiet library, stood a shop with a sign made of dark walnut wood. The sign simply read, "The Temporal Haven." The window display was filled with clocks of every shape and size. There were tall grandfather clocks that stood like sentinels, mantel clocks made of porcelain, and delicate pocket watches resting on velvet cushions. The owner of this shop was a man named Arthur. Arthur was as old and steady as the mountains surrounding the village. He wore a tweed vest that smelled of pipe tobacco and cedar wood, and a pair of spectacles that always sat on the very tip of his nose. His hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were incredibly steady. They were hands that understood the delicate language of gears and springs. Arthur was not just a mechanic. He was a guardian of moments. He believed that a clock was not a machine to measure how much time you had lost, but a device to remind you to cherish the time you had. He spent his days in the warm, golden light of his workshop, listening to the collective heartbeat of 1,000 clocks ticking in unison. It was a symphony of rhythm that brought peace to anyone who stepped inside. One particularly cold Tuesday evening, the peace of the shop was disturbed. The heavy oak door was pushed open with a force that made the bell above it jingle violently. A gust of freezing wind rushed into the warm shop, carrying with it a swirl of snowflakes. A man stepped inside. He was dressed in a sharp, expensive suit that was entirely unsuited for the mountain weather. His shoes were polished but wet with snow. He was young,
perhaps in his 30s, but his face looked aged by stress. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his forehead was creased with deep lines of worry. He held a silver pocket watch in his hand, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles were white. He did not greet Arthur. He marched straight to the counter, his breathing shallow and fast. "I need this fixed," the stranger said, his voice tight with impatience. "I was told you are the best. I need it done now, immediately. I have a train to catch in 2 hours, and I cannot be late." Arthur looked up from his workbench slowly. He did not rush. He carefully placed his tweezers down on the velvet mat. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the stranger with calm, gray eyes. "Good evening to you as well," Arthur said softly. His voice was deep and slow, like the tolling of a distant bell. The stranger ignored the greeting. "Look at it," he insisted, thrusting the watch forward. "It is broken. It runs too fast. Every day it gains minutes. I am always early, yet I feel like I am always late. It is racing, and it is driving me mad." Arthur reached out and gently took the watch. It was a beautiful piece, silver with intricate engravings of vines and leaves, but when he held it in his palm, he could feel a strange vibration. The watch was indeed ticking, but the rhythm was frantic. It felt like the heartbeat of a frightened bird. Arthur held the watch to his ear. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound coming from inside the silver case was not a steady rhythm. It was a chaotic, galloping sound. It sounded like a machine that was trying to run away from itself. He opened his eyes and looked at the man. "What is your name, sir?" Arthur asked. "Julian," the man replied, checking his own wrist, which bore another modern watch. "Why does that matter? Can you fix the gears? The mainspring must be loose. Or perhaps the balance wheel is defective." "It matters," Arthur said, placing the watch on a soft leather pad, "because a watch often mimics the heart of its owner." Julian scoffed. "That is ridiculous. It is a machine. It keeps time. That is all." Arthur shook his head gently. "You are mistaken, Julian. A watch is a storage device for energy. You wind it, giving it your tension, and it releases that tension slowly throughout the day. If you wind it with aggression, with panic, with a need to rush, the metal remembers. This watch is not broken mechanically. It is overwhelmed." Julian looked at the old clockmaker as if he were speaking a foreign language. "I don't have time for philosophy," he snapped. "I have deadlines. I have meetings. I run a company that employs hundreds of people. If I stop, everything falls apart. Just fix the watch so it tells the correct time." Arthur sighed. He picked up a jeweler's loop and screwed it into his eye. He leaned over the watch and opened the back case. The tiny gears were spinning with a ferocity that was alarming. The hairspring was vibrating so fast it was almost a blur. "I can fix it," Arthur said quietly. "But not in 5 minutes, and not while you are pacing the floor like a caged wolf." "What do you mean?" Julian demanded. "I mean that to slow down this watch, I must first slow down the environment in which it sits," Arthur explained. "I will repair it, but you must agree to my condition. You must sit in that armchair by the fire. You must drink a cup of tea. And you must not look at your other watch or your phone until I am finished." Julian opened his mouth to argue. He wanted to shout, to grab his watch and leave, to find another repairman who would simply do the job without a lecture. But then he looked outside. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain that obscured the street. He looked at Arthur, who was already waiting for an answer with infinite patience. And he realized he was tired. He was so incredibly tired. "Fine," Julian breathed out, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I will wait, but please hurry." Arthur smiled. "I never hurry, Julian. That is why I never make mistakes." He gestured to a worn, velvet armchair near the cast-iron stove. Julian walked over and sat down. The chair was soft, sinking under his weight. The heat from the stove radiated outward, warming his frozen hands. Arthur went to a small side table and poured a cup of herbal tea from a ceramic pot. He handed it to Julian. It smelled of chamomile and dried lemon. "Now," Arthur whispered, returning to his workbench, "let us see if we can teach this metal how to breathe again." The shop fell silent, save for the ticking of the clocks. But it wasn't a stressful silence. It was a heavy, layered silence. Julian took a sip of the tea. He tapped his foot nervously on the floor. He wanted to check the time, but he remembered the old man's rule. He forced himself to look at the fire instead. Arthur turned on a small brass lamp over his workspace. He picked up his finest screwdriver. The real work was about to begin. He was going to dismantle the racing heart of the watch, piece by piece. Arthur sat at his workbench, his posture curved over the tiny silver universe of the pocket watch. The shop was quiet, except for the collective, rhythmic breathing of the 100 clocks on the walls. It was a layered sound, a texture of time that felt like a warm blanket. He began the disassembly. With a screwdriver no thicker than a sewing needle, he loosened the bridge screws. He worked with a slowness that would have maddened Julian an hour ago, but now, in the heavy warmth of the room, it felt necessary. Arthur touched the mainspring barrel. This was where the energy was stored. It was wound tight, coiled like a snake ready to strike. He carefully released the ratchet. There was a faint metallic sigh as the spring unwound. The pent-up energy, the stress of the metal, dissipated into the air. Julian, sitting by the fire, felt his own shoulders drop as he watched the old man work. It was hypnotic. There was no aggression in Arthur's movements. Every touch was an act of care. The old man placed each tiny screw, each gear, into a segmented wooden tray. He arranged them in a perfect line, creating order out of complexity. Arthur spoke without looking up, his voice barely rising above the hum of the fire. The mainspring was wound too tight, he murmured. It was trying to deliver power faster than the gears could handle. When we force things, we create friction, and friction creates heat, and heat destroys the machine. Once the watch was dismantled, the cleaning began. The gears, though they looked shiny to the naked eye, were covered in microscopic dust and dried oil. This was the debris of the city, the invisible grit of a rushed life. Arthur prepared a small glass bowl filled with a clear cleaning solution. It smelled faintly of citrus and spirits, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the warm air. He picked up the tiny brass wheels with his tweezers and lowered them into the bath. He used a brush made of soft sable hair to gently sweep across the teeth of the gears. He moved the brush in slow, circular motions. He washed away the old, sticky oil that had turned into sludge. He washed away the dust. He lifted a gear out of the solution and held it up to the light. It gleamed. It looked new, reborn. It was no longer burdened by the grime of the past. Julian watched the process through half-closed eyes. The steam from his tea purled up, obscuring his vision slightly. He found himself matching his breathing to the old man's movements. When Arthur dipped the brush, Julian inhaled. When Arthur lifted the gear, Julian exhaled. The frantic racing of his mind began to slow down, matching the... Now came the most critical part, the lubrication. A watch does not run on metal alone, it runs on oil. But not just any oil, and not just any amount. Arthur opened a tiny vial of synthetic clock oil. It was viscous and clear. He dipped a fine oiler, a tool that looked like a needle, into the vial. He picked up a droplet so small it was barely visible to the human eye. He focused his loupe on the jewel bearings. These were tiny synthetic rubies, pink and perfect, that held the axles of the gears. He touched the tip of the oiler to the center of the ruby. The drop of oil transferred perfectly, creating a tiny golden meniscus. It was a cushion. It ensured that the metal pivot would float, never grinding against the stone. "Too much oil," Arthur whispered, "and it attracts dust, gumming up the works. Too little, and the metal grinds itself to dust. It is about balance, Julian. Just enough to let it move freely. No more, no less." Julian nodded slowly, his chin resting on his chest. He thought about his own life, the excess, the noise, the constant more. He realized he had been running his engine without oil for years, grinding his own gears. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but in this quiet shop, it felt profound. Finally, it was time to put the heart back together. Arthur reassembled the gear train. He placed the pallet fork. He dropped the balance wheel into place. The balance wheel is the regulator. It swings back and forth, dividing time into equal segments. It is the part that makes the ticking sound. Arthur tightened the final screw. He gave the crown a gentle turn, winding the spring just enough to wake it up. He nudged the balance wheel. It swung to the left, then to the right. The watch began to beat. But it wasn't the frantic, galloping sound from before. It was a strong, steady, deliberate rhythm. It sounded healthy. It sounded calm. Arthur held the watch to his ear and smiled. He listened to the steady beat for a long moment, nodding his head in time with the machine. He adjusted the regulator lever by a fraction of a millimeter, tuning the instrument until the rhythm was perfect. He polished the silver case with a soft chamois cloth until it shone like a mirror, reflecting the warm glow of the fireplace. He stood up and walked over to Julian. The young man was barely awake. His tea was finished. His hands were relaxed in his lap, and his head was leaning against the wing of the chair. The lines of worry on his forehead had smoothed out. "Here," Arthur said softly, holding out the watch. Julian blinked, pulling himself out of a near slumber. He reached out and took the cold silver metal. He looked at the face of the watch. The second hand was sweeping smoothly, not jerking. Julian held it to his ear.
He heard the difference immediately. It wasn't racing anymore. It was walking. "It sounds different," Julian whispered. "It is breathing," Arthur corrected. "I removed the friction. I cleaned away the old burdens, and I gave it new oil. Now it does not need to run. It simply needs to be." Julian looked at the watch, then at the old man. For the first time, he noticed the kindness in Arthur's eyes. He realized that the repair hadn't just been for the watch. The hour he had spent sitting in that chair, watching the slow, deliberate work, had done something to him. It had forced him to stop. Arthur walked back to the window and looked out at the snow. The storm had settled into a gentle drift. "The watch is fixed," Arthur said quietly. "But the owner, he still needs a little more winding down. Stay, Julian. The roads are icy. Rest for a moment longer. Time is not running out. It is just flowing." Julian didn't argue. He placed the watch in his pocket, feeling its steady, slow heartbeat against his side. He leaned back into the chair, closed his eyes, and let the symphony of the clocks carry him away. Julian sat in the velvet armchair for a long time, holding the repaired watch in his hand. The metal warmed against his palm. The shop was filled with a comfortable, drowsy twilight as the winter evening deepened outside. The fire in the cast-iron stove had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the floorboards. He felt heavy. It was not the heaviness of exhaustion or stress, but the pleasant, grounding weight of relaxation. It was the feeling of a stone settling at the bottom of a quiet lake. For the first time in years, the knot of anxiety that usually lived in his chest had uncoiled. He looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. The pendulum swung back and forth with a hypnotic rhythm. According to the time, his train was due to leave in 20 minutes. If he ran, if he sprinted through the snow, hailed a carriage, and rushed to the station, he might just make it. His old self would have already been at the door, coat buttoned wrong, adrenaline pumping, checking his phone. But Julian did not move. He looked at the door. He looked at the snow piling up against the glass, turning the world outside into a soft, white blur. The thought of running felt alien to him now. The thought of rushing back to the noise, the emails, the deadlines, felt like stepping back into a cage he had just escaped. Arthur, the clockmaker, was quietly tidying his workbench. He arranged his tools with deliberate care,
wiping the tweezers, capping the oil vial. He did not rush Julian. He did not look at the clock. Julian finally stood up. His joints popped softly in the quiet room. He walked over to the counter. "How much do I owe you?" Julian asked, reaching for his wallet. Arthur looked up, peering over his spectacles. "For the repair? A few coins. For the time you spent sitting in the chair, that was free. That was necessary." Julian placed a generous amount of money on the counter, far more than the repair was worth. Arthur tried to protest, but Julian shook his head. "Keep it," Julian said softly. "You didn't just fix the watch. You fixed the timing of the man holding it." Arthur smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He picked up the watch one last time and handed it back to Julian. "Remember," Arthur said gently, "the watch serves you. You do not serve the watch. It measures time, but it does not dictate how you spend it. Walk slowly, Julian. The mountain isn't going anywhere." Julian nodded. He put on his heavy coat. He wrapped his scarf around his neck. But he didn't button his coat frantically. He did it slowly, button by button. He looked at the door. "I am going to miss my train," he stated simply. Arthur nodded. "Yes, I believe you are." "And I think," Julian said, a small smile appearing on his tired face, "I think that is exactly what I need to do. There is an inn down the street. I will stay. The city can wait. The deadlines can wait. Tonight, I will just sleep." Julian opened the door. The bell chimed, a soft sound of farewell. He stepped out into the night. The cold air hit his face, but it wasn't biting. It was refreshing. It tasted clean and crisp, like frozen pine needles. The snow had stopped falling heavily. Now it was just drifting down in large, lazy flakes that glittered in the light of the street lamps. The village of Stillwater was asleep. There were no cars, no sirens, just the muffled silence that only snow can bring. Julian walked down the street. He didn't check his watch. He didn't check his phone. He walked slowly, listening to the crunch of his own footsteps on the fresh snow. He stopped to look at the bakery window, dark and quiet. He stopped to look at the library. He saw the world not as a blur rushing past him, but as a series of beautiful, still paintings. He reached the inn. The windows were glowing with warm yellow light. He knew there would be a fire inside. He knew there would be a soft bed. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the missed train, gratitude for the broken watch, and gratitude for the old man who had forced him to sit still. He touched the pocket where the watch lay. He could feel its steady, calm heartbeat against his side. Tick, tick, tick. It was no longer racing, and neither was he. Back in the shop, Arthur watched Julian disappear into the snowy night. He nodded to himself, satisfied. He locked the front door, turning the heavy iron key with a solid thud. He turned off the overhead lamp. The shop plunged into shadows, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the snow-covered windows and the faint glow of the dying fire. Arthur began his nightly ritual. He walked to the great-grandfather clock in the center of the room, the master clock. He opened the glass case. He inserted a large brass key into the winding holes. He turned the key. The sound of the ratchets clicking was loud in the silence. He was storing energy for the next day. He was preparing the time for tomorrow. He closed the case. The pendulum continued its majestic swing. Arthur walked to the back room. He was tired. His eyes were heavy. The rhythmic ticking of the hundreds of clocks surrounded him like a choir singing a lullaby. They whispered of seconds passing, of minutes flowing, of hours resting. He sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the peaceful white valley. The world was still. The race was over. Arthur closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the room. The ticking became a white noise, a river of sound carrying him gently into the dark. In the valley where time rested, the clockmaker and the businessman both fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, guarded by the steady, comforting heartbeat of the machines that measured eternity.
And so, our story comes to a gentle close. May your mind be calm, and your dreams be kind. If you're still listening, we'll be waiting for you here again with another story from Midnight Murmurs Studio. Until then, sleep well.